Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy. Today, we are excited to have the multifaceted Carlos Batista with us. Carlos has had an incredible journey from serving the United States Marine to leading security teams as a two-time CISO, and also transitioning into software engineering and development roles in AWS. Carlos, super excited to have you with us. Welcome.
Hey, thanks a lot, Raj. It's really great to be here. I'm excited to be a part of the show.
Thank you. And so you are retired right now, and how's that going?
I'm more than retired right now. I'm retired forever. At least that's the plan. And it's going fantastic, Raj. It's been just over 6 months. And so I'm having a great time traveling, spending a lot more time with my wife, who also retired 3 months ago. And we're just having a blast doing a lot of traveling. We love a number of hobbies, which we're really totally diving into. Like we're playing more tennis and we're reading a lot more. So it's been great, Raj. It's so far been the best decision professionally and personally of my life.
I love it, Carlos. I'm going to start off with something. Maybe let's start something different, something controversial. What is your maybe unpopular opinion about security? Why don't we start with that?
Oh man, so you're gonna put me on the spot right off the get-go. Okay, unpopular opinion. Okay, so if one jumps out at me, and yeah, this might be a little controversial or provocative, but I am not convinced that security awareness really delivers all the value that I think we hope it should do. It deliver. And so I think what I'm saying is that maybe security awareness is a little overrated. And that might be, I don't know, maybe that is a little provocative. So let me sort of nuance that a little bit. Like what I'm not saying is that security awareness is useless. I think you absolutely have to teach your employees certain critical things about how to work with your team. So, for example, how to report security incidents, because email is still like very sort of like there's very much a human factor there. You have to sort of teach them how to use email safely. But I guess my perspective is that I would almost prefer to invest dollars that might have gone into having like a world-class security awareness program into actually making the technologies that your employees integrate with as safe as possible. And the analogy I like to use is a light switch. So, today, like I don't think you can see the light switch in me. That's right next to me here. But basically, I don't have to receive training on how to use a light switch safely to prevent from electrocuting myself. Engineers and folks who built them built these wonderful things called faceplates that help ensure that you don't electrocute yourself when you use them. I would prefer to invest security dollars that are very tight usually into making our tools and technologies, laptops, servers, things of that nature, safe by default so that employees don't have to think about that. Now, you still, like I said, you got to do security awareness because there's some things that you can't put faceplates on, like email. But my argument would be that I don't know that it makes sense to hire, like to have like a major production come in and do a security skit for your employees and spend, like 5, 10, 15% of your security budget when you can use those assets or those investments to harden your environment to keep your users safe by default. Does that make sense?
No, that absolutely makes sense. I think I've been one of those on the receiving end trying to take these trainings, and it's sort of very painful sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, some of them are actually pretty entertaining. I mean, if you've seen some of them out there, they're really engaging. They're almost like right out of like The Office or something like that, and
Yeah.
you literally wind up laughing. But they're not cheap either. And so I think there's things that you minimally have to do either because it's the right thing to do, but sometimes and more importantly, because compliance or other regulatory regimes or even customer contracts require that you do a certain base foundational set of security awareness. I would try to find out where that is, make sure you do that, and then before you spend a dollar more, ask yourself, could that dollar be used to better harden the thing that you want to train your employees about so that they can't make that mistake in the first place? That's my
That makes
perspective.
sense. Makes sense. What is something about what we are doing in the industry that has surprised you of late?
Good question. I have actually been out of like security as my full-time job for almost 2.5 years. So I left being a CISO when I joined AWS to go lead some of their security engineering teams within their AWS services. But I think the thing that really has surprised me the most, and not in a good way, is how fractured third-party risk management continues to be. I still try to keep up with what's going on, and it's still very evident that security questionnaires still are the soup du jour for how to largely assess a vendor's security readiness to be used within a particular company. And when I left, it was right around the very beginning of where I guess trust centers were beginning to that's really take a hold as a means to sort of provide that awareness in a more automated online way for potential buyers to understand where you are from an assurance perspective. And while I think there is some traction in that space, Raj, I don't see it be having the level of trust, unfortunately, that I think I would have loved to have seen, where whether you're a large bank or an energy company or a highly regulated customer of some kind, you're generally able to sort of absorb those artifacts out of a customer's trust center in some sort of automated fashion and make an assessment without sending a bespoke, 300, 400, 500 question questionnaire, which is still, I think is still, pretty unfortunate.
Got it. And how do you see this um, across industries, and how did you get this perspective?
Um, it's funny. I've been on sort of both sides of the coin. I spent the earlier half, or the first half and plus of my career in these highly regulated industries. I spent nearly 10 years over at SunTrust Banks, now called Truist, one of the largest banks in the United States. I also spent some time with GE Energy, again, two highly regulated businesses. And anytime that they are out there to buy anything, you have to go through a pretty rigorous and robust security regime to ensure that your product can assuredly do what it says it can do and do it safely. So as a buyer, I got to really sort of dive into what are all the security controls that these vendors or potential vendors have. Are they meeting the bar from a security perspective? And it's when you're a large company, you're able to sort of really poke these vendors to make sure that they're doing the right things. And I think that's a net positive for security. On the other hand, I spent the latter part of my security career, as a as a vendor working for startups. And so it's a whole other side of the coin, where you're not a large company with a high degree of, I guess, what I would call negotiating leverage to be able to say, do whatever you want. And so you wind up being the recipient of all of these third-party risk questionnaires, which, if you're doing enough business, can drive your GRC teams wild, having to respond to all of them in a bespoke fashion and making sure that you're answering, of course, truthfully, but also consistently across all of these different items, and that you're managing all of the inevitable follow-up conversations with each of these prospective buyers to ensure that they're satisfied with how you've answered all those questions. It's a difficult problem to scale to. And so it's, again, I'm hopeful that third-party risk management will get better. I think there's a lot of interesting new players in that space who are trying to sort of tie that together to make that journey easier, both for buyers and sellers. But it's still a little bit surprising to me, Raj, that it's so fractured as it is today. I mean, what's your perspective?
No, I totally agree with you. And I think there is a lot that needs to be done there. I think there is a lot more progress happening, but more to accomplish in that space. And I think the large language models and some of the sort of the upcoming technologies are certainly going to help in some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you mean being able to use an LLM to respond to questionnaires, or also to digest and summarize,
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, you've had an illustrious career, Carlos. You've been a two-time CISO. What do you see as the reality of being a security leader that most others don't see?
I think the thing that jumps out at me is most people don't realize how stressful of a job that can be for everyone in a security organization. But I am speaking specifically towards the leaders of that security org. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to ensure that you and the business are doing all of the right things to prevent yourselves from having a disclosable incident of some kind. And so I think because of that, I think unfortunately a lot of security leaders really struggle with the stress of being in that role, because it's a role where in most cases you're pushing a big snowball up a hill to get the support that you need to make the changes and the implement the programs that are needed to, in your estimation and your team's estimation, to properly protect the business from a variety of different threats, some of which you might control and some of which you don't. And so I know that I've gone to bed wondering, oh man, this new threat is out there. Like, what's the impact to us? Are we going to get hit? Like the ones that always jump out at me are these big sort of like third party incidents or CVEs that affect, infrastructure that you might run. And it's like, oh man, like, okay, great. I just learned about this tonight. But we know that this is already being exploited in the wild. Am I hit? Like that's stressful. And
Absolutely.
it's definitely something that every security leader needs to learn to sort of accept, that, hey, like you're in a role that, has a little bit of, I guess, of this sort of like risk of thinking through like this type of things that can happen to you, to the business. And so, and I think unfortunately another thing that's sort of come of that is security leaders, particularly CISOs, now have to consider the potential for personal or legal liability for, based on how, like, the decisions that you make or don't make during an incident or leading up to one. So that's certainly something that, every security leader needs to think about. There are obviously ways to help mitigate that through, things like D&O insurance and other things, but it's certainly a stressful role that I'm not sure, a lot of folks appreciate, but it's something that I certainly have thought about and struggled with personally.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. I think I had an opportunity to read in flight about the state of New York versus Timothy Brown on SolarWinds. It's unbelievable the level of stress that you talked about that's on security leaders today.
Yeah, it kind of puts some security leaders in a position where they need to ask questions that they never really had to think about before. Like, hey, like what legal protections do I have from the companies I work for? Do I need to consider my own personal liability protection in case things go awry? I mean, the Tim Brown case is an obvious example. There are others, of course. And so it's something to consider.
Now, do you see the stress levels varying across industries? You've been in different industries. Do they remain the same? Do they go up or down? What's your take?
I didn't quite get the first part of your question, Raj.
The stress levels and as
Oh,
a security
yeah,
leader.
yeah. I mean, so I feel like my personal take is the overall stress level, I don't think changes. I think what changes is what you're stressed about.
Okay.
And so in some of like larger, more highly regulated environments or financial services environments, I was, there's a level of stress or kind of dealing with the constant the audit and regulatory frameworks and all of the various constituents that want to evaluate your security. And so if you work at a large bank, you probably have to deal with internal auditors, external auditors, internal operational risk, regulatory compliance and regulatory audits. You'll have to deal with your board. And that's to say nothing about finance or other groups that also want a perspective on your security program. And so you have to manage those relationships and that work carefully, because if not, you run the risk of spending more time talking about your security program than actually leading the organization and essentially delivering the program. And so that's a challenge that a lot of leaders, especially those in highly regulated environments, have to struggle with. On the flip side, and I'll sort of be brief here, when you don't have that like really big like sort of regulatory framework, you probably don't have the resources. You don't have as many resources at your disposal to affect a strong security program. So you're thinking more along the lines of, hey, are we doing all the right things to keep bad guys out? We're trying to move super fast as a startup company. I don't want to say we're taking shortcuts, but we are moving fast. And so you need to you're also thinking very, very thoughtfully about how do I help the organization and the business make the right choices around security without imposing a level of friction that essentially halts or slows down the ability to gain and retain business. So it's a whole other sort of thing to think about.
And how do you keep your team motivated through this?
Yeah, you got to understand your team. This is just my opinion. I feel any good leader takes the time to get to know their team. You're not necessarily like being buddy buddy and going out for drinks all that or at all. But understanding what really sort of like makes them happy. What are they driving to? Why are they in this job? What do they want? What makes them happy? And that changes from person to person. For some folks, it's, hey, I want to be challenged. I want to do complicated, thoughtful, innovative work. For others, it's stability. I want to be able to just do a good job for a place that's going to, make sure that they take care of me because I have a family to feed and a family to take care of. For others, it's money, and that's okay. We kind of talk about, well, money shouldn't be. It's okay to say I'm motivated by compensation. That's perfectly fine. Understanding what those things are, I think, is really vital for any effective leader, sort of drive to keeping the team moving forward. And so once you sort of have a sense as what those things are, you look for those things and opportunities that sort of appeal to those motivations to help inspire the team as a whole towards moving to whatever goal you're trying to get the team towards moving.
Got it. Got it. And how do you, so I think in all this, you're not just talking about defending, right? You have to also deliver value. How do you manage that, Carlos? And how do you know that you have arrived?
Oh, man, that's a really tough and tricky one. I think I learned so much more about what it means to really deliver when I moved over to AWS, and I was now expected to deliver product features, product releases on a timeline. So when you have a big conference like AWS reInvent, there's some certain releases that tend to happen around that time or before that time, and so it's a pretty clear line in the road of what you're trying to deliver to. So one of the things that I really sort of got to build some muscles on was sort of delivering on very tight timelines. And through that, in order to be able to do that effectively, you've got to build and have engineering discipline. Really understanding what it takes, Raj, to build something and build it. How long is it going to take to build this new API? And so in my pure security days, it might have been okay for a team to say, yeah, we think it's going to take us, a couple sprints to build that API, test it, and release it into prod. And then you get into the weeds and it's like, oh my God, it's really 8 weeks because we didn't really think about this particular dependency or this other team that needs to review things before anything gets loaded up on their API gateway or what have you. And so I think that's one of the things that I felt that I really had to sort of figure out in my time at AWS is really understanding and diving deep into when engineers say X amount of time. Okay, walk me through why we think that's the right number. Because there aren't too many opportunities to add slack to a project, once you got things right. Now, what I will say, and I loved this about AWS, was that security was truly job zero.
Okay.
What I mean by that is, everything I just said about delivering things on a deadline, super important. No one batted an eye if something needed to slip because of a security problem. It was always the best decision to make sure that, hey, we need to get that thing done securely. And so that was great to see from my time there. And I don't necessarily want to turn this into like an AWS love show, but that's something that I definitely really admired and appreciated about AWS and how they think about security engineering as it relates to security, which is
Beautiful.
something that is candidly a bit of can be a challenge in other organizations where, you will get tough questions or about like, well, can we fix that security vulnerability in a follow-up release or a fast follow? And the answer may still be no, we have to wait, but there's a lot you may have to sort of manage that conversation a little bit more actively.
Got it. And how do you see what do you see as the role of governance, risk, and compliance as we talk about this guy?
From a security perspective, as a CISO, I always thought of GRC as the foundation of the entire security program. You you can't really,
Foundation.
yeah, like you really can't. The whole point, in my opinion, of GRC is, first and foremost to set the bar, to understand what is the company's risk tolerance as it relates to cybersecurity risks, where the business is in relation to managing those tolerances. So putting together a maturity assessment to understand like where you are compared to where you think you should be. And if you don't have that, like I feel like a security program just sort of running around like the blind leading the blind a little bit, like you don't know it's good enough. So then you're going to have engineers and others on one day or managers on one day just kind of going, hey, I think this is what we should do from a security perspective. And then 2 weeks later for another project, it's, oh, I think it's this thing over here. And that leads to confusion. It leads to lost trust across the engineering teams as a whole because they see you as like sort of evaluating things with a different perspective. You're going to get asked outright, wait a second, you just told this team over here that they didn't have to do all of that. And now you're telling us that we're doing basically the same thing. You're telling us that we have to go do that. That's not right. And so you're going to wind up losing credibility with your stakeholders. So to me, governance is kind of where it starts. They're the team that understand, again, working with the technical peers in security, working with engineering and IT, and most importantly, working with the business line as well and top management to understand, hey, this is where we need to be. And understanding that what was good enough at one company may not be good enough at another, or maybe candidly too good at this particular company. And so that's the job of a strong GRC leader, is to help the CISO and help the executive team understand what is the bar based on current threats, current risks, and where the company's sort of like what the estate looks like from a security perspective. Does
Got it.
that make
Got it.
sense?
And no, that may absolutely make sense. And so I think I'm sure that listeners are the question that is running through their mind is how do we define this good enough? Is there any advice?
It's different from every other sort of like company or business. And I think again it sort of boils back down to understanding what is the company's tolerance for cyber risks. So one thing that sort of helped me is rather than walking into a meeting with a COO or a CFO or the CEO and saying, hey, what do you think our cyber risk tolerance is? Probably, I mean, I don't know, maybe it goes far with those, but what I have done instead of doing that is I've tried to come in with some understanding of what the business does into those conversations. So meeting with the CFO's direct reports, a couple of them, or a few of the chief revenue officers' reports, or a few of the other CEO directs in engineering and IT, and try to understand the business and understand the technology and have a perspective to walk into the CFO's office. I'll just pick on that role for a bit and say, hey, look, I've been here for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever the number is. Here's how I think of our view some of the most critical risks to this business. What's your perspective on that? And then kind of getting from that point of view, hopefully by then you already have some opinion on how the company's security maturity is going. So you're assessing what identity and risk looks like, what the governance program looks like, what sort of vulnerability management program is in place, et cetera, incident response. And it's from that I think you can come into that conversation and say, look, okay, great. I think we're aligned, or maybe we're not, and that's okay. From my perspective, I'm going to do some more digging because I do think that we have some, potential gaps to what we think those risk tolerances are. And what I'd love to do is come back to you and the rest of the executive team and walk you through that perspective, because as we look into the remainder of this year or even next year, if it's budget season, I want to make sure that I have your alignment on how we sort of think about our security investments and program to help align with those risks, because we may need to make some changes. We may need to do some things that we're not, or stop some things that we are doing.
All right. Now, and how do you communicate those security needs to those executives, to to the board, in addition to whatever you just talked about?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I look for from my leaders is options. So like it's very easy to come in and say, "Hey, this sucks," right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we've done it before. Like, that's terrible. Why are we doing that? Great, okay, and it's less easy to say, "Here's what we should do," and that's great that that folks do that too. But like when it comes to like, all right, we need to spend money, maybe a lot of money to fix this or hire people. What's even better sometimes, especially for the tougher problems that have more ambiguity or greater cost, is to come in and say, here's the problem, that sucks, and here's like the best way, the Cadillac Escalade way to fix that problem. And here's the, perhaps maybe the Lexus or mid-tier. And then if we have to, here's the, economy-based vehicle way to fix that issue. And then we can also always just do nothing, but then talk through like what are the
Each of
benefits
the options. Got it.
and the pros and cons, if you will. Yeah, exactly. Of like, okay, well, this is what we get out of doing that, and this is what we get out of doing that, so that we can come in and make rational decisions about what to do. And then through that, what I've tried to do, particularly in my two CISO roles, was I try to sort of like figure out like how do we take these risks, these top line sort of material, fundamental, what I would call existential risks to the business from a cyber perspective, and how do I sort of model or quantify some of those risks? I mean, it's easy to say, well, the likelihood of that risk is low, but the impact of that risk is high. Great. That works for a lot of folks. What I prefer to do is try to model or quantify that a step further. Can we, even though there is some ambiguity, it's not perfect, can we somehow come up with some kind of a percentage around what that likelihood looks like? Can we identify based on conversations with finance, conversations with legal, can we identify a dollar value or a potential dollar value of that bad thing happening? And then through that, you can then sort of pivot off of how you feel about your controls around that thing, and then do some basic modeling. So you can do something like a Monte Carlo simulation to sort of take 1,000 different scenarios of the bad things happening and looking at, all right, are these risks really fundamental, and are they really low likelihood, high impact based on those things? And so at the executive team level, I've always felt that executives tend to appreciate that level of diligence or rigor around sort of how to think about those risks rather than just coming in with a 9-box diagram.
Got it.
And so that's kind of how I thought about it, Raj. Now, having said that, when I've talked to the board, I have found that you actually do need to find a way to synthesize that back into something that's a little more quickly digestible by a board audience. Typically, a CISO might get somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes a quarter, maybe a month with the board. Point is, it's not a lot of time to walk them through a complicated quantitative risk model, listing out your risk register and all of these different possible things that can happen. Sort of like really speak to those big existential risks, 6, 7, 8, 9 maybe, and talk about those at the board level. And yes, perhaps using some kind of 9-box based on your quantitative model.
No, I think that's brilliant.
Yeah,
That's
that's kind of
actually a
that's what I
brilliant
do.
way to look at it. So start with a quantitative model, but simplify it and bring a qualitative approach to this as well, so that people across the board can understand these risks and relate to these risks. Beautiful. I'm going to flip the question the other way. As a CISO, what information do you want to be presented with, and what typically do you see as the challenges when you get this information?
Yeah, I think the thing that jumps out at me is the again making sure that you've thought through multiple approaches to the problem. So I mentioned different options for different types of problems. It sort of shows me that you've sort of like asked yourself the tough questions about like, is this the right thing to do? So I've done it. I've seen a problem and said, oh my God, we have to fix this by doing this specific thing. And it's very easy to arrive to that. And there may be a number of biases that sort of drive you to that. I think sort of challenging yourself with, wait, are there other ways to fix this issue? I think is something that I particularly value from my engineers and leaders. And obviously coming with data. So instead of just saying, TPRM is broken. Well, okay, great. I think we know that. Tell me why. How long is it taking us on average to respond to a customer questionnaire? How long is it taking our own due diligence when we evaluate our own vendors? What can we do to bring that number down? What are some different options that we have? So I tend to appreciate data and options when having when I think about the data or the things that come from my team, because we are in the risk management business, not the risk avoidance business. There's no such thing as that. And so being able to be thoughtful and critical about our own sort of perspectives and biases is something that I've always appreciated from, again, my team
Got it.
or
Got
others.
it. And how do you, for a security manager or a GRC manager, how can they go about building a business case for budget and resources as they, and as a leader, what would your can you give us some tangible advice in terms of how we can think about it?
Yeah, so I think, like I said earlier, I think one of the biggest, most important jobs of a GRC function and a security team is to sort of set the bar. And so understanding, all right, these are the risks that we have. This is where we are in terms of managing those risks. And here's this gap. How do like the GRC teams that I see that are really good at that are really adept at describing what that gap is and how this thing helps close that gap. So in with some of the last couple CISO roles that I held, what we would try to do is illustrate how that quantitatively and say, hey, look, we take, making up a number, $100,000 and we spend it towards solving this particular security problem with tools, process, people. Here is how we feel the likelihood of that event might change, or how the impact of that event might change because we're able to detect it sooner, remediate it sooner, so the blast radius is perhaps a little small. That's the thing that I've noticed that I think GRC teams that are good at sort of selling are really good at. The other thing that I think is I mean super gifted and I almost want to call out one of your previous guests, Mosey Plot, for doing this super well, was really understanding the voice of the customer. So like Mosey and I had the privilege of working with Mosey at a company called Better Cloud, and Mosey led all of GRC for Better Cloud. And one of the things that he was just brilliant at was talking to customers about what do they need, and sort of using that as a great feedback loop into the strategy, the security strategy of the company, to sort of feed them like, hey, we probably can, we're getting really good feedback from customers and prospects that we should really be thinking about key management perhaps in this way, or logging and monitoring in that way, or identity in that way. Are these things worth considering? And so having customer signal, I think, is vital for GRC teams to sort of add as another sort of thing in the toolbox when you're thinking about what to invest in or how to get support for what the GRC function feels they need to achieve their mission or to enable their business.
No, I love what you're saying. I think basically, I mean, the idea that you can reinforce GRC teams can reinforce the security team, even in building a business case, right? And throughout the process. I think that's a sort of a brilliant way to think about maybe how we can build a better business case, how we can create much more tangible outcomes.
Yeah, and it also increases credibility with the business when you're taking the time to understand customer signal. And so because it's sort of like it positions the GRC function. You mean the compliance people, the audit people? Like they're actually talking to our customers and understanding like what they
Totally.
need to adopt our product more or purchase us. That's pretty powerful. And it definitely opened a lot of doors, not just for Mosey in the specific instance, but also for me and the rest of our security team. When the engineers knew that, hey, like here's somebody who understands the technology, is customer focused or customer obsessed, to use the Amazon speak, that really speaks a lot to again, the credibility of a GRC leader when they're willing to sort of pick up the phone and talk to customers. Not a lot of GRC folks do that.
Got it. So you have a very interesting sort of set of experiences, Carlos. You have been a security practitioner, you've been a CISO, you've also been a security sort of on the engineering side, right? Software development and engineering. How do you build trust with the engineering teams?
It takes time. It's not something that comes overnight. Engineering teams have a lot on their plate. They've got a ton of stuff to build, not a lot of time to build it, and being a little provocative here, they often don't have the time to answer a bunch of security questions from the governance and compliance team. And so I think like one of the things that really jumps out at me in terms of how to build credibility is transparency. Like so we there's a lot of audits and things that come from these various funnels, right? So customers and prospective customers, you're always going to get inspected by your customers all the time in one way or another, with a few exceptions. But one thing you're always going to know, especially if you're in a B2B business or a SaaS business, is you're probably going to have pretty good line of sight to when you're going to renew your SOC 2 Type 2, to when you're going to, when it's time to renew PCI compliance, or when you're going to have a regulatory audit, from the Department of Financial Services in New York because you do business in New York. You know when these things are going to happen. You might even know when some of your biggest customers are going to audit you because you can reach out to them and say, hey, for 2025, are you going, like, can you tell me like roughly like your rhythm for audits for next year? And so with that, one of the things that we tried to put together at Back, which I thought was fairly successful, was we put together an audit calendar
Wow.
for the engineering team. And for ourselves, so we understood like what the like the rhythm was going to come in from all these different types of audits. But it's super helpful to understand what that cadence is going to look like, and when you share with the engineers and you say, hey, look, 9 months from now, I'm going to need like one of your engineers for a few hours a week for 2 or 3 weeks to help answer a lot of these questions. That helps buy some credibility and some trust that you've got your act together, and you're not a GRC leader running around like a chicken with its head cut off, doesn't know what's going on, and is constantly just coming in with the fire drill of the week on some audit that needs a question answered by Friday at 4 p.m. And that'll work a couple times, but do it enough and you'll start to lose friends in the engineering side. So that's one thing that jumps out at me, Raj. The other thing is the GRC folks that I think are really successful with engineering teams take the time to understand the tech.
Got it.
Like take the
Got it.
time to understand, hey, like if you're running a microservices environment on Spring Boot or something like that, or on Kubernetes, that you take the time to understand Kubernetes fundamentals, that you take the time to understand what a DevOps pipeline looks like, and how could a GRC function potentially integrate with that or ask questions of that pipeline without having to go pick up the phone or Slack and ask someone a question. Those, I think, in my experience or observation, engineering teams appreciate when they don't have to dumb things down or distill things, at a super, super high level and can speak to you on their terms and you get it. Like you don't have to. I'm not saying you've got to know Java and you've got to like truly understand every possible component of the K8s or Kubernetes ecosystem. That's not what I mean. But like understanding like what the fundamentals are in your whatever your engineering team's stack happens to be, boy, you're gonna win a lot of points pretty quickly.
And I think it helps to relate with engineers fairly quickly as well, right? And understand their pain points.
Yeah, it's just it just makes the conversation go smoother. And I mean, similarly, like you could almost make that same argument with a CISO speaking to finance, speaking to marketing. Like, no, you don't have to know how to like file the quarterly statement of, for the business, but you do need to understand, a basic balance sheet, income statement. You got to understand like basic fundamental financial questions about how the business brings in money and how they think about that revenue stream. Basic concepts so like ARR and whatnot. It makes sense to understand those things because it makes the conversation just go better.
Absolutely, absolutely. Where do you see the industry heading, and how should security leaders you think should adapt to the changing times?
That's a good one. So I mean, obviously AI is a thing. We could probably have a whole other conversation about that. I'm not going to spend too much time there. AI is changing everything, including our space. We got to get smart about it. Full stop. So moving along. The other thing that is sort of a minor thing that I think folks are beginning to understand, but maybe not, is what I call click ops, or it's not just my term, it's been around, is kind of going away. And what I mean by click ops is this sort of like, it's sort of like a jargon to say, hey, like doing things via, like implementing changes in production via the console, via a graphic user interface, or even the command line, just, popping open a shell and typing a command and doing something. That's going to largely go away in favor of um, infrastructure as code, policy as code, where you're actually creating a PR or a CR that gets reviewed by multiple folks and commented on and merged into some DevOps pipeline to implement that change. Because especially as we continue to sort of shift towards the cloud, or at least shift some workloads towards the cloud, that's really one of the best, most fundamental ways to assert that changes are, or if not immutable, less mutable, because once that pipeline runs again, things get reverted. And so that's sort of my take on that is if you're someone in security who's been doing this as long as I have, you probably need to start understanding and learning about how to automate changes to devices, to infrastructure through code, versus making changes in a console somewhere. At Better Cloud, even identity-specific changes went through a PR. Like if you needed access to GCP, nobody's going into the console and adding an IAM user for you and adding you to some role. Like we just didn't do that. Those changes went through a PR process reviewed by at least one other person on the engineering team and merged in. And so that's just how I think the industry from an infrastructure perspective, and maybe even from a GRC and identity and other point of view, is going to.
No, I think that's brilliant. How do we, oh, from ClickOps to GitOps is what I'm hearing. That's brilliant. Right.
Yes, I love that. That's exactly what I mean, Raj. I hope I think things are going in that direction, and so
Absolutely.
I'm a big fan of it. I'm going to
Yeah.
use that. Cops to good
Yeah.
ops.
Um, I'm going to ask you to wear your dream hat on. What would your dream security solution look like? Maybe you can take a very specific example.
A dream security solution. So like, what do you mean? Like I can just invent something and not worry
Absolutely.
about like anything, like just money, like no money's no object. I could just Man,
I think we'll suspend reality for the time being. So we'll
yeah,
just
yeah. It's like I'm trying to like. Okay, let's think here. I think if there was one thing that jumps out at me is I'd love to be able, in addition to like solving TPRM, but I won't get into that, is I'd love to be able to solve vulnerability management. I just, thinking back to when I was doing this stuff, the amount of calories that my teams and I and infrastructure engineers, application engineers, governance folks would spend responding to and remediating the constant plethora of vulnerabilities that would come in. I think I try to figure out a way to automatically, like when a CVE comes out, just instantly patch everything or reinstantiate everything running a non-vulnerable version of the thing because we just spend so much time on patch management and not just from a perspective of patching the things, but also talking about what we're doing. One of the things that like drove me wild near the end of my pure security career was every time a big sort of like news cycle vulnerability got out there was the inevitable like 30, 40, 50 different inquiries from various customers asking, hey, have you seen this vulnerability that just came out today? Can you tell us about what your current exposure to that vulnerability is? If you're exposed, like when are you going to be patched? And what are the things that you're doing to mitigate your exposure while you're waiting to be patched? And can you let us know when you're fully patched? And so that's a lot of churn.
drowning in the
And
noise.
yeah, I don't know how I would solve that. I think it's again, I feel like just sort of throwing reality out the window. If there were a way to either magically patch or remediate things as soon as they came out without any impact to production availability, I think that'd be pretty cool and interesting. Or if there were a way to at least immediately say, all right, in my estate, I run OpenSSL, whatever, dot blank, but this issue is not exploitable in my environment because X, Y, and Z, other mitigating controls, and I only need to worry about this small portion of my environment, and I go patch that immediately. That's those are things that would be interesting to me, Raj. I'm curious. What about you? Like, what would be your dream solution besides the one that you're building? Which
No, I think some of what you have talked about is very, very close to our heart. So essentially, we believe that GRC is an observability layer for security. Some of what I mean, and it's a one-two punch for us. And if we can automate infrastructure as code and we can do cloud formation templates and Kubernetes manifest, why can't we automate services, right? Whether it is GRC services, whether you're running an assessment, whether you're collecting evidence, whether you're creating a graph model, whether you're asking questions, whatever they are, right? Why can't they be automated as code as well, right? And why can't they run through, to your point, from a ClickOps to a GitOps model is something that we are very, very passionate about that allows you to sort of make it much faster, reduce the cost, the incremental cost of getting these things done, and most importantly, brings the team together, right? Whether they are engineers working on their sort of their job, right? And to how do you sort of get all the way from there to the auditors for a much more effective risk assessment at the speed of DevOps.
I, I certainly would love to live in that world. So it's a tough problem. I mean, I recognize that. It sounds like you do too. It's just I just harken back to just the amount of energy that we would put into just maintaining a strong posture from a vulnerability management perspective in light of the bombardment of CVEs that just constantly come in. It's a big job.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. We started with a provocative question. Do you have any other unpopular opinions that we missed?
Oh man. So okay. So I'm just gonna be super like unpopular on this podcast, and it's fine. But the thing that while I was thinking about the awareness question or the awareness unpopular opinion, I I don't know. I have to. I almost want to think about this more, but I am not completely convinced that we have to encrypt everything. It's sort of like one of these
That is
blanket
provocative.
things. It's one of these
You are
blanket
being
things.
provocative.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. Like, I mean, there is a performance cost to encrypting everything. But there's another cost too, and that cost is around key management, right? Like you've got to protect the keys, you've got to store them somewhere, you got to rotate them, you've got to protect how you call them in your code. And not everybody does that, and that's just the way it is. And so it's like it's just easy to say it's just easier to encrypt everything, right? But it's maybe not. And so this is again where governance I think has a really good say here to say what the bar is. Yeah, maybe you do need to encrypt all of your like customer data with PII. Do you need to encrypt the pencil sharpening system or the lunch menu application, or maybe not, because the cost to sort of manage all that encryption over time just may not be worth it. And then also, even if you are encrypting, make sure that that's not like the fun, like the only real pillar of your security program, because if, let's face it, in many breaches where the bad guys get in, they typically also get your keys. Not always, but if they have root in your like cloud environment, they might also have access to those keys to decrypt everything. Now there's exceptions to that. Like if you have a FIPS 41, like a FIPS 142 level 3 HSM, and you hold you control your own keys in your own on-prem environment, maybe a different story. But it's just you should be thoughtfully asking whether or not it's worth it to encrypt everything.
Got it. And how do you convince, if we can extend that question, how do you convince your auditors when you take a provocative stand like that?
It's so again, it boils down to your governance program. Auditors aren't there to necessarily tell you exactly what to do. In my experience, auditors are there to ensure that you're doing what you say you're doing. They're auditing your program, not necessarily the veracity of the controls you chose. That's been my experience, unless you're doing something that is just completely beyond the pale. Well, no, we don't give passwords to people. We give admin to everybody, and we don't really worry about any of that. Auditors are going to have some like pointed questions about what are you doing. And so going back to your question, I think a governance function with that point of view could say something like, well, we have a security standard that classifies data based on certain types of risks. And we consider the pencil sharpening application to be non-public data. And we don't require encryption on non-public data. Therefore, this application doesn't require encryption. That's one approach to sort of help defend why you wouldn't do that to an auditor who would then come to audit your security program, who would then look at these artifacts and go, oh yeah, your policy says this, your standard says that, and what you're actually doing, it aligns with that. Therefore, you're good to go.
You are an voracious reader, as I understand.
I don't know about that. I'm reading more now that I stopped working. But I don't know that I'm not one of those, like, I think Bill Gates reads something like 50 or 60 books a year, maybe more. I'm closer to more like 15 or something. Not a voracious reader, but I will say that like being retired, it makes it easier to read more.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would recommend? Books, podcasts, any resources, anything that you would recommend for our audience?
Yeah, so today I just finished The Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. There's a Netflix series on it. I actually saw it before I read this book. The book is fantastic. I've already bought the other two books, and they're amazing. And there's a lot of great books out there on cybersecurity and leadership, and I won't necessarily speak into like any particular one, but to answer your question more directly as it relates to security, I think the thing that really benefited me in my career was having a network. Like getting to know others in the industry, getting out there and building relationships with your peers, with others that you see as aspirational peers, with others that you can learn from that may be a little bit more junior. And I've to me that is the by far the most valuable thing that I ever had in my career, where I can reach out to my peers and say, hey, I got this problem. Like, I'll anonymize it to make so obviously protect confidentiality, but the like, how are you thinking through this issue? And there are a ton of Slack groups, Discord groups. Reddit is actually still, I think, fairly useful for a number of things in terms of like understanding how others think through problems. Leverage those networks and build them, on your own. It's going to become super valuable, especially as you, um, I guess, like get promoted up the chain, if you will. At the CISO level, there are a number of really good closed Slack groups out there that I still continue to be a part of that are absolutely tip top in thinking and being able to go to these groups with a fair degree of Charterhouse rules or TLP protocol, pick your confidentiality regime, to be able to talk about things fairly confident like confidentially and get some really good perspective on how to think about that problem.
Now,
So
that is great advice.
that's the thing that jumps to me, man. Is like build relationships, build your network. The problems that you're dealing with, someone else is dealing with it
I'm
right
telling you,
now.
yeah, totally. No,
So
absolutely. No, absolutely.
ask away.
No, that's brilliant. How do you spend your retirement now, Carlos?
I so it's funny. Like I said, I just hit 6 months. Those first 3 months, Raj, I got up like whenever I wanted to. Like at 10 in the morning, I'd like pour a big bowl of like Fruit Loops or Cocoa Puffs and just sit in front of the TV and just watch TV all day and do nothing. It was great. Now that I'm 6 months in, I definitely find myself wanting to sort of make sure that I'm staying busy. And so what I've fortunately I've got a number of hobbies and things that I enjoy doing. I enjoy, like I said, tennis. My wife and I we play a fair bit. I enjoy trying to stay fit, so exercising. I actually draw on my own. So it's yeah, I learned how to draw as a kid, and I picked it back up for real like in the last few years. There are a couple of other things I do. I enjoy music. I play a little piano, or at least that's what I like to tell myself. But yeah, it's things like that that keep me engaged and keep my mind busy and going. I've also found that I still love cybersecurity. I still love technology, and so I definitely still find some time here and there to read about it, stay on top of what's going on. I like experimenting and playing with some of the tech that's out there. So I still maintain my cloud accounts with AWS, and I still log in on occasion and putz around. So I have plenty to keep me busy, Raj. So that's more or less what's up to.
I'm super glad to hear. Now, do these hobbies help you with your stress level when you were a CISO?
They did, man. And that's another sort of tidbit I would recommend anybody in this business do is find outlets to sort of manage that stress because it's very easy to you know self-medicate or find other unhealthy ways to manage through that. So for me, it was always extremely therapeutic to draw when for example, like just to like it was just so relaxing and cathartic to just sit there and draw. And sometimes playing tennis, you're mad at something or like frustrated about something at work, you can get out there and just hit that ball as hard as you can. And that's another great way to relieve some pent up stress. So I'm glad you mentioned that because that's a really I think important thing for anybody in security and maybe even most industries to have is find an outlet, find something that you love to do, and find the time to do that for yourself on the side.
Got it. Got it. And we are almost at the end of the segment, Carlos, and I want to ask you any final advice, words of wisdom for our audience and for security leaders out there?
I think what I just said might have been it. and like really just sort of finding that outlet for what you're doing. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of sort of like things you want to make sure that you're doing around making sure that you're enabling the business. You're not, you know, I guess I'll put it this way. The thing that I used to tell my teams was that, look, the business has a choice in who and where they get their security from. You know, it's right now, like they're choosing to use us because we are helping enable them to like grow the business, achieve their mission, the company's purpose, whatever that happens to be. When we stop doing that, the company's going to realize they have this choice, and they can always choose differently. They can choose to have a managed services security provider provide all their security, or outsource the security team elsewhere, or just replace the team entirely. And that's something that, you know, definitely a CISO has to consider. I've seen CISOs walked out the door because they're considered blockers or just, you know, obstructionists is the word I'll use. And so make sure that you think about that. Like you know, just consider that, hey, at the end of the day, security is here to sort of help the business move forward, not there for its own sake. And I think a lot of really smart security professionals have gotten caught up in that trap in the past, to their detriment.
From defending to delivering, as you said at the beginning.
Yeah, or obstructing. Yeah.
I'm super glad to have had this conversation, Carlos. Thank you very much. You have a great day.
No, thank you, Raj. I really enjoyed this. It was great to catch up with you. So I appreciate it. And thanks again.
Thank you.